Hello, Bobby Torres of Frightbox recording here. So the question is, how exactly do you go about getting your mixes to translate across multiple playback systems? And also, when it comes to gain staging, how should you go about setting up your signal flow while recording your guitar tracks? Welcome to Viewer Questions Answered, episode 15. Okay, so without any further ado, let's get to this excellent group of questions submitted by my loyal email subscribers. And question number one comes from Mr. Vasquez. I know there's no quick fix to this, but man, what I find most difficult is getting mixes to translate. On my studio monitors, everything seems to sound good, and even when using reference tracks, things seem to sound close to my ears. But when taking the mix elsewhere, like my car or earbuds, it's nowhere close to what I'm hearing on my monitors. Any tips on why that is or what can be done to help that? Thanks. Okay, well, Mr. Vasquez, what you just mentioned is such a common problem that we all face. I don't think I've ever met a mixer that has not struggled with this at one point or another. And usually, more often than not, it comes down to low-end management. See, the problem is most modern studio monitors are tuned in such a way or voiced in such a way where everything sounds great on them, which is actually not a good thing because it's hard to hear when there's a deficiency within our mixes, especially low end. So I'm sure you know by now, like let's say you have a mix that sounds great on your monitors, even when you compare it to a pro mix, it might sound relatively close, but the second you play it on a stereo system or within your car, it completely falls apart. The low end might sound out of control. Sometimes the mid-range can sound harsh. And the reality is that you really have to focus in when listening to reference tracks on your setup. In other words, really pay close attention to how much low end is happening within the pro mix versus your mix. Let me give you an example. What I tend to do, let's say I have a mix sitting where I feel it's sounding pretty decent. I'll check it against a reference mix really quickly just to see where my low end is at. And more often than not, it's usually a little too out of control and there's just a little too much of a buildup in the sub range. And it's not blatantly obvious on studio monitors. It's something you have to intentionally really focus in on before you even take your mix out to multiple playback systems. The other range that's generally problematic is the upper mids. They usually sound really sweet on playback systems or on monitoring systems or studio monitors, and then they sound harsh and brittle on earbuds or in the real world in general. So to put it simply, I would focus extra hard on your low end and your upper mid range. And when you compare it to your reference mixes, really focus in and pay close attention, especially while you're in the later stages of the mix, even on studio monitors. And I also want to say this, don't beat yourself up. This is normal. Even pro mixers check their mixes on multiple playback systems like their car. I sat in on some big records being mixed when I was in college during my internship, and I was amazed to see the producers checking the mixes out within their cars. So it's something we all face. It's totally normal. And again, the main thing to focus in on is your low end and upper mids. And don't worry, it's completely normal. So Vasquez, thank you so much for your question. Good luck with your future mixes and keep me posted on your progress. Okay, and our next question comes from Alex. Hey Bobby, longtime listener, first time caller. I have a question about drum bus compression. I used the content clove, I don't know how to pronounce that, bus compressor on one of its presets as the final step in mixing drums to glue the whole kit together and make it sound cohesive. Problem is, I'm finding if I set it to give body and glue and warmth to the snare, kick, and toms, the cymbals become shrill and washy. If I turn it down a bit to accommodate this, I lose cohesiveness in the rest of the kit. The cymbals and shells seem to be diametrically opposed to each other's favorite compressor settings. What's your thought process for setting a drum bus compressor that avoids this issue? Finally, huge thanks for all the amazing content you put out. Your channel is dope as hell. Cheers from Sheffield, UK, Alex. Okay, Alex, this is an awesome question and I do have a solution for this. Because believe it or not, again, much like with the last question, we all face this issue. Cymbals, by nature, just sit in a completely different range, both dynamically and frequency response-wise from your kick, snare, and toms. That's just the nature of drum sounds. So what I personally do is I do not include my cymbals in my drum stem or my drum bus. So when I compress my drum bus, my cymbals are not included at all. Super simple, it works for me. Now, not everyone is a fan of this because some people like to compress their cymbals with their drums, especially when using parallel compression, so everything kind of sits within that same glue. For me personally, I don't ever seem to need this within my own mixes. If I do want to create that overall cohesive drum glue with a compressor, what I'll tend to do then is just use a second compressor on my drum stem that includes my cymbals and all my shells, and I use a very, very subtle amount of compression, not a lot of compression, again, because I end up with that same issue that you end up with, that it just makes the cymbals way too out of control, way too harsh, and just brings up the hi-hat, which is a killer in everyone's mixes. It's very common. Now, an alternate method to the one I just mentioned that a lot of engineers like to use, especially when using parallel compression, is they'll use sends on their individual drum tracks. So in other words, they'll be able to send a certain amount of their kick, snare, toms, and cymbals independently to the same bus compressor, but they have strict control over the level that they're sending individually to that same compressor. It's more or less the same thing that I do. I just don't include my cymbals at all, but if you do want to still include your cymbals, that's a great way to do it. It offers you the flexibility, and you can send less of your cymbals to your parallel compression. So you can have your parallel compression set really extreme, but mainly only send your kick, snare, toms, and you can actually, vary the amount of those individual elements amongst themselves and your cymbals. So to sum it all up, what you're describing is completely normal. If you're slamming your drum bus for, extra warmth, like you've mentioned, yeah, it's normal for your cymbals to get really shrill because, again, dynamically and frequency response wise, they're sitting in a completely different range than your main shells and drums. So Alex, excellent question. Hopefully that helps, and keep you posted on your progress. Okay, our next question here comes from Frederick. Hey Bobby, first of all, thanks a lot for your amazing YouTube content that you've been producing. Even though I'm not producing metal music and lean more towards rock and punk rock, the way you explain the different recordings and mixing concepts are very applicable, easy to understand, and non-hardware driven like a lot of content out there. You sure made my pandemic less boring, as I had lots of stuff recorded and it's starting to have a decent tone. Thank you. My question would be the following. As I'm on the hunt for the perfect guitar tone while recording, I realize that the volume and waveform are not necessarily proportional. The relation between amp volume, amp gain, interface gain seems to come into play controlling the waveform, and I was wondering what would be an ideal waveform for distorted guitar. I'm recording direct out from my JCM 900 into a Scarlett Solo and IRs in Reaper. Thanks again for everything, Fred. Okay, well, Fred, this is an excellent question. Let me just answer the whole part of the question that has to do with the waveform. I don't pay attention to the waveform. You'll drive yourself nuts looking at a waveform of a distorted guitar. They're gonna look different depending on the head you're using, depending on the IR you're using, depending on the cab you're using, depending on the preamp. All of those different elements will affect the actual waveform. So if I were you, man, I really wouldn't worry about that too much. Now, when it comes to gain staging, let me just say this. I have a very, very, very simple mindset when it comes to gain staging in recording. And it's simple, just don't clip. Now, if we're talking about gain staging as far as your guitar plugged into your head, that's different because we're talking about preamp gain in a guitar tone. So depending on the actual gain going into your head, that will obviously affect your tone. So for example, I like to use a tube screamer before the amp head just to tighten up the low end, and that would be affecting the gain staging of my actual guitar tone. Now, where people get tripped up is the tone that's being recorded into their interface. People think there's some magical level that's gonna improve your tone, and it's not true. All you have to do is not clip the input of your interface. You don't have to record super hot if you're recording at 24-bit, and also don't record super quiet like -60 or something like that. You don't want to be down in the noise floor, just at a reasonable level that's hot enough where it's, I don't know, -12 below zero, but not enough to where you're clipping, because digital clipping can be next to impossible to get rid of, and you don't want that on the way in to your software. Now, where I feel people are getting confused about this is because they might watch tutorials with engineers that are using transformer-based preamps or tube preamps, and they talk about driving their preamps. This is different. If you're using an interface, your interface has just a clean, transparent preamp that doesn't have a sound to it. A lot of people think there's some magical level that's gonna affect their tone, even in their interface, and it's not true. Now, if you're using like a Universal Audio Solo 610 tube preamp, which I once owned, you could drive that one harder and it will affect your tone, but we're not talking about that. And even then, it's gonna affect your tone way less than people think. So just to sum everything up and give you the straight answer, don't worry about what the waveform looks like. You'll drive yourself insane. Now, you should be paying close attention to your gain staging before the front end of your amp. That's gonna affect your tone, depending on if your guitar is hitting the head harder or softer. And as far as gain staging when recording through your interface, again, don't worry about that as well. Just don't clip and don't record too quietly in the noise floor, and you'll be good to go. Because audio interfaces are 100% transparent, no matter what people think. So Frederick, thank you for your excellent question. Okay, and our final question here comes from Jesus. Hello, Bobby. Today I bring to you two questions that relate to guitar editing and live situation stereo guitars. I've seen most of your mixing tutorials, if not all, and one of the things that you point out as most important is editing the raw tracks before any processing. I have a bit of trouble with this because I don't know if I should chop and relocate every single pick strike that is out of place to keep things tight, as that is my main problem when mixing guitars. The second question is about making a guitar sound wider or fuller in a live situation where the band consists only of a drummer and a guitarist/vocalist with a synth and keys backing tracks. Thank you so much in advance and cheers from Spain. Okay, well, Jesus, let me answer both of these questions. When it comes to guitar editing, I follow a very, very simple approach. You don't have to go crazy splicing up every single guitar strike. Now, if you're into gent and you're into some of these insane productions where everything sounds like a robot is playing, like the Terminator or something like that, I know that was really hot for a while in metal. Not my cup of tea personally, but I know a lot of kids like that kind of stuff. If that's your thing, then you might have to chop up every single pick strike. But if you're into more organic sounding productions, even modern productions that have more of an organic feel to them, don't worry about cutting up every single pick strike. Just make sure that your guitars are pocketed against the grid and against your drums. Simply put, that none of your guitar tracks are rushing the beat, because this is what really will kill your overall tone and your overall mix. So for example, let's say one guitar player is playing dead on in the pocket and the other guitar player is slightly ahead of the drums. Generally, it just won't sound musical. In those cases, you would just take the one performance, slide it back slightly, close the gaps that have to be closed, and make sure that none of the guitar parts are ever conflicting or pushing the beat. I also do this with bass as well. No, I don't go in there and chop up every single guitar strike. Back in the day when I was doing a lot of gent bands, that's something I sometimes had to do if the band really wanted that style of production. But me personally, I still want the band to sound like a band. That's just my opinion and my own personal musical taste. I still want the band to sound natural and not like a robot. So again, just remember, make sure those guitars are not pushing your beat and that your bass is not pushing the beat. Now, as far as widening a guitar within a live situation, I answered this in a previous episode, but I'll mention it again. If you're dealing with one mono guitar sound, very simple. Use a mono to stereo delay and delay one side by 15 to 25 milliseconds. So in a sense, what you're doing is taking that mono signal, splitting it off to the sides, and delaying one side and creating a hole in the middle of the stereo spectrum and giving the listener the effect of two rhythm guitars or just a wider guitar sound. I do this a lot. I even do this with vocals, synths, and different sources that need to be widened that are mono. Now, if you don't want to use a delay plugin, you could simply duplicate your track, pan both of them hard, so one left, one right, and then drag the audio of one of the files back by 20, 15, or 25 milliseconds, somewhere in that range that sounds natural to you. That will give you instant width and will make your mono source sound wide. So Jesus, hopefully that helps you, and keep me posted on your progress, especially with the guitar editing. Let me know how that works out for you. A lot of people seem to struggle with editing, and it really doesn't have to be complicated. Like I said, just make sure things are pocketed, and you'll be in good shape. So I would just like to shout out and thank my subscribers for hitting me up with these excellent group of questions. You're really helping other viewers because, again, a lot of us face the same issues in the studio. And I've been doing this for so long that I sometimes forget that these were ever issues that I had to face. And by you asking me these questions, it reminds me, and again, at the end of the day, helps other people, which is what this channel is all about. So thank you. Now, if you've submitted a question and I haven't gotten to it yet, just be patient. I will definitely get to it within one of these upcoming videos. If you found this video helpful, like, comment, subscribe, and share. And do not forget to click the little bell icon so you can be notified every time I upload one of our weekly videos on all things metal and rock production. If you're interested in some Frightbox swag, I've got t-shirts, mugs, and other cool stuff on the way. There's a link below to the Frightbox merch store in this video's description. And finally, I would just like to say that I want you to achieve better results with the gear you already have. And this is why I've put together my 5-step guide to better heavy mixes. There's a link to the free guide below in this video's description. Download the free guide and start pumping out better mixes without having to purchase any new gear. And until next time, happy mixing.